Journalist laughs at Karoline's faith. She fires back with the perfect response. It was a brisk morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of cold that cut through even the thickest of coats. Inside the studio, the lights were blinding, and the cameras were rolling, capturing every inch of the set. Karoline Leavitt sat confidently across from the reporter, a seasoned journalist known for his sharp, often controversial questions. His name was Mark Sinclair, and he had made a name for himself by stirring the pot, challenging political figures with ruthless questioning, and often pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Karoline, however, was no stranger to being challenged. As a staunch conservative with firm beliefs in the value of faith, family, and country, she had faced scrutiny many times before. But today, she was ready. She had come to this interview prepared, knowing that Mark's reputation for baiting his guests with politically charged questions meant she'd have to stay calm, collected, and unshaken. "Welcome, Karoline," Mark said, his voice smooth, yet laced with a subtle, almost mocking tone. "It's good to have you here." "Thank you for having me," Karoline responded, her voice steady. She offered a polite smile, but her eyes revealed the sharpness of someone who had been in the political arena long enough to know how to read people. Mark leaned forward, his gaze intense. "So, Karoline, let's get right to it. You've made a lot of noise lately, particularly with your outspoken views on faith. Some might say that in today's political climate, having such strong religious convictions is, well, a bit outdated. Do you really think your faith has a place in modern politics?" Karoline's eyes didn't waver. She could feel the trap being set, but she wasn't fazed. The question was loaded, designed to make her defend her beliefs against the growing tide of secularism in politics. Mark continued, sensing he had her on the defensive. "After all, in a world where separation of church and state is such a hot topic, do you think your faith should really be influencing your decisions on public policy? Isn't that something better left at home or, say, in church?" Karoline's hands rested calmly in her lap as she took a moment to collect her thoughts. She could feel the heat of the spotlight, the weight of the audience's attention, but her faith had prepared her for moments like this. This was her moment to not only defend her beliefs, but to stand tall in the face of someone who underestimated the power of faith in shaping her worldview. "Mark," she began, her voice even, yet carrying an underlying strength, "I don't see my faith as outdated. I see it as timeless. Faith isn't something that should be compartmentalized or hidden away when it's convenient. It's a part of who I am, just like my values, my upbringing, and my commitment to serving the people of this country." Mark's lips curled into a slight smirk, a hint of skepticism in his expression. "So, you're saying that your faith should influence your political decisions?" He leaned in, as though daring her to take the bait. "That's a bold stance, especially when many would argue that religion and politics don't mix." Karoline met his challenge with unwavering confidence. "Faith is the foundation of who I am. It's what guides me every day. And for me, that means applying those values of love, justice, and truth to the work I do in politics. If I didn't, I wouldn't be true to myself or to the people I serve." The silence in the room thickened. Mark's eyes narrowed, clearly not expecting such a poised response. For a moment, he seemed almost taken aback. He had expected her to flounder, perhaps stutter in the face of such a direct confrontation. But Karoline, with a calm resolve, had stood her ground, showing him that her faith wasn't something to be mocked or ridiculed. Mark, clearly trying to regain control, smirked again. "So you're telling me that your faith will be your guiding force in making decisions about things like healthcare, climate change, and international relations? How does that work, exactly? Can you give me a real-world example of how your faith impacts policy?" Karoline wasn't surprised by the question. She had anticipated it. "It's about seeing people as more than just statistics or problems to solve," she said, her voice growing more passionate. "It's about understanding that every life matters, that every decision we make should reflect the dignity and value of human beings. My faith teaches me that we have a moral responsibility to care for others, especially the vulnerable, and that's exactly what I'm fighting for." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed, but still skeptical. Interesting, he said, leaning back in his chair. But don't you think that sounds a little idealistic? In the real world, politics is about compromise, negotiation. It's not about relying on faith. Karoline's eyes met his, a calm smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Mark, I understand your skepticism. But I don't believe that faith is incompatible with practical policy decisions. It just means that we have to put people first, not special interests, not party lines, but the people who need us most. The interview continued, but Mark's earlier confidence had begun to waver. His jabs at her faith had not gone as planned. Karoline had turned the tables, framing her beliefs not as a weakness, but as a source of strength, a guiding force that informed her political work. For now, the battle of words was just beginning, but one thing was clear: Karoline wasn't going to back down. The tension in the studio was palpable. Mark Sinclair, who had built his reputation on tearing down his guests with relentless questions, was no longer the confident host who had walked in. Karoline's calm yet unyielding responses had already begun to rattle him, and the edges of his usually sharp demeanor were beginning to fray. He had expected a simple back-and-forth where he could play the role of the skeptic and expose his guest's flaws, but she wasn't biting. As the interview continued, Mark steered the conversation into murkier waters, hoping to trip Karoline up with another pointed jab. He leaned forward once more, eyes narrowing with that familiar glint, the glint of a man convinced he'd find a weakness. So, Mark began, his tone changing slightly. You talk about putting people first, about seeing them as more than statistics. But how exactly does that play out when you're talking about policy decisions that impact millions? Healthcare, immigration, education. These are serious issues that require more than just good intentions. They require pragmatic solutions. Karoline's lips tightened in a subtle smile, a flicker of understanding passing through her eyes. She had anticipated this shift in approach. Mark wasn't just attacking her faith anymore, now he was questioning her ability to translate those beliefs into practical politics. It was a challenge she was ready for. Mark, Karoline responded, her voice firm yet calm, it's not just about intentions. It's about having a vision that aligns with the values of dignity, justice, and care for others. Yes, we need pragmatic solutions, but those solutions should come from a place of compassion, not cold calculations. She paused, leaning in slightly to make her point. I'm not advocating for some utopian ideal. What I'm advocating for is a shift in how we approach our policies, putting people before profits, communities before corporations. Mark's eyebrows shot up, a mixture of disbelief and skepticism crossing his face. So, you think that putting people before profits is the answer to fixing our economy? He asked, a smirk forming. Do you really think that's a practical stance? Because last I checked, economics doesn't work that way. You can't simply ignore the bottom line. Why not? Karoline shot back quickly, without hesitation. Why does the bottom line always have to come at the expense of the most vulnerable among us? It's not just about wealth accumulation for the few. It's about creating a society where people have opportunities, where the systems work for everyone, not just those at the top. Her words carried weight, and the audience, though silent, seemed to sense the shift in the air. Mark's confident smirk began to fade, replaced by a slight narrowing of his eyes as he attempted to regain control of the conversation. I mean, we can all agree that the government needs to take action, he said, but his voice had lost some of its previous sharpness. But your faith-based approach to policy, isn't that a bit, well, limiting? Don't you think it's a little dangerous to let personal beliefs guide governmental decisions? Karoline's expression didn't waver. She had heard this argument countless times before, that faith and government should be separate, that allowing one's personal beliefs to shape policies was inherently dangerous. But for her, it wasn't about imposing religion on others, it was about living in a way that aligned with her values. And those values didn't just live within the walls of a church. No, Mark, she answered slowly, her tone unwavering. I don't believe it's dangerous to let my values guide my actions. In fact, I think it's dangerous to leave those values behind in favor of a system that prioritizes wealth over well-being. My faith teaches me to love my neighbor, to care for the needy, and to fight for justice. Those principles are at the core of who I am, and I would be doing a disservice to the people I serve if I ignored them." There was a long silence. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but this time, he hesitated. He had come to the interview expecting to dismantle her beliefs, to show the audience that someone who leaned so heavily on faith could never make sound political decisions. But with every answer, Karoline made it clear that her faith wasn't a weakness, it was a source of strength. It gave her clarity, compassion, and a drive to push for policies that were rooted in a deep sense of moral responsibility. "Well, I have to admit, Karoline," Mark finally said, shifting in his chair, "you certainly have a strong conviction. But again, let's look at the practicalities of governance. The world doesn't operate based on faith, no matter how much we might wish it did." Karoline nodded, as if considering his words carefully. But she knew this wasn't about ideals versus reality. This was about whether the systems we've built should reflect the values of humanity and compassion, or whether they should merely serve the interests of the powerful few. "Mark, the systems we have today have left many behind. They've prioritized profits, corporations, and political games over human lives," she replied, her voice resolute. "If we don't start putting people first, we risk losing what makes us truly great. It's not about faith in the abstract, it's about faith in the possibility of a better future. And that's why I'm here today." Mark paused, clearly weighing her words. The sharpness in his eyes softened for just a moment, but he quickly regained his posture. It was clear that this wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. "So, tell me," Mark continued, shifting gears slightly but still probing, "how does all this translate into action? How can we apply these faith-driven values to something like healthcare? What would that look like in a real-world policy?" Karoline leaned back, her posture relaxed, but her gaze still focused. "I'm glad you asked," she said, her voice calm but filled with a quiet confidence. "Because it starts with the belief that healthcare is a human right, not a privilege. And if we prioritize people's well-being over profits, we'll make sure that every person, regardless of their income or status, has access to the care they deserve." The words hung in the air, and for the first time in the interview, Mark found himself momentarily speechless. The challenge he had posed had been met with a solution, one that wasn't rooted in cold economics, but in the very faith he had mocked. And as the cameras captured this moment, the dynamic of the interview shifted once again. Karoline had held her ground, and it was becoming clear that the battle for the narrative had only just begun. The interview had reached a tipping point. The back and forth had been intense, but Karoline's steadfastness had already turned the tide. Mark Sinclair, though still trying to maintain control, was clearly rattled. His previous sharp jabs at her faith had failed to elicit the reaction he was hoping for. Karoline's responses were measured, calm, and yet packed with an undeniable conviction. The room felt heavier now, as if the audience could feel the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as a predictable political interview was rapidly becoming a battle of ideologies, faith versus skepticism, compassion versus pragmatism. Mark, realizing that his usual tactics weren't going to work on Karoline, took a moment to regroup. He adjusted his posture, leaned back, and adopted a more calculated tone. "Well, Karoline, you've certainly made your point about how faith can shape a person's values. But let's get real for a second," he began, his voice now dripping with a touch of condescension. "You're in a profession where compromise is key. Politics is about making deals, about balancing different interests. Faith can't possibly play a role in that, can it?" Karoline remained unfazed, her eyes locked on his with a steady, unflinching gaze. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that sooner or later, Mark would push her to defend her faith in the face of the so-called real world of politics. The challenge, though, was not new to her. Her faith had shaped her life in every way, guiding her decisions, both personal and professional. She knew that this was her chance to make a statement, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed because of their beliefs. She took a breath, allowing the weight of the question to settle for just a moment before responding. "Mark," Karoline said, her voice low but resolute, you're right that politics requires compromise. But what you fail to understand is that compromise doesn't mean abandoning your values. It means finding common ground while still staying true to what you believe in. The words hung in the air, but Karoline wasn't done. She leaned forward, her gaze unshaken, her tone now piercing with intent. I've always believed that real change doesn't come from sacrificing your principles to appease others. It comes from standing firm in those principles and using them to guide your decisions. That's what I do. And that's what I'll continue to do. I'm not here to appease the political elite or play the game. I'm here to make decisions that reflect the dignity and worth of every human being. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but Karoline didn't let him interrupt. You see, she continued, her eyes now filled with a quiet fire, I don't need to compromise my faith to be effective in politics. In fact, it's the very thing that keeps me grounded, that reminds me why I'm here. To fight for people who don't have a voice, to stand up for those who are overlooked by the system. Faith gives me that clarity, that purpose. Mark was now visibly taken aback. He had expected Karoline to falter, perhaps soften her stance, or even backtrack. But she didn't. Instead, her response was measured, powerful, and confident. It was everything he hadn't anticipated, a perfect retort that not only addressed his challenge, but turned it into a point of strength. For a moment, the silence in the room was thick. Mark's usual smirk had faded, replaced by a brief, almost imperceptible look of disbelief. It was clear that Karoline's answer had caught him off guard. But he quickly recovered, as reporters are trained to do, trying to mask his surprise with another question. Okay, Karoline, Mark said, attempting to regain his composure, but don't you think that your approach will alienate people who don't share your religious beliefs? Politics is about unity, isn't it? If you push your faith too much, aren't you risking dividing people? Karoline's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. She could see exactly what he was doing, trying to corner her into a position where she had to justify her faith in the context of political divisiveness. But she was ready for this too. Mark, she said, her voice calm but assertive, what I'm advocating for is unity in its truest form, unity based on shared values of compassion, justice, and respect for others. If someone disagrees with my faith, that's their right. But what we should all agree on is the fundamental dignity of every person. I'm not asking people to share my faith. I'm asking them to understand that my values shape the way I make decisions, and those values are rooted in a commitment to care for the vulnerable and to seek justice. Her words were clear, and there was no mistaking the depth of her conviction. Karoline wasn't trying to convert anyone, she was simply asserting that her beliefs weren't a hindrance to her work, but a powerful tool for it. It was a message that resonated with anyone who had ever been judged for standing firm in their values. Mark, now sensing he wasn't going to get the answer he wanted, tried one last time. But Karoline, doesn't faith cloud your judgment? Doesn't it limit your ability to see the bigger picture, to make decisions that benefit everyone, not just those who think like you? The question hung in the air, but Karoline didn't hesitate. No, Mark. Faith doesn't cloud my judgment, she replied, her voice unshakable. It clarifies it. It reminds me that I'm not here to serve myself or my political party. I'm here to serve the people. And the bigger picture isn't about appeasing everyone. It's about doing what's right. With that, Karoline had delivered the perfect retort. It wasn't just a defense of her faith, it was a reminder that her beliefs were integral to who she was as a person and as a politician. She had turned the tables, once again, showing that her faith wasn't a liability, it was her strength. And with every word, she had solidified herself as someone who wouldn't back down, no matter the pressure. Mark sat back in his chair, clearly deflated. The interviewer, who had spent so much time trying to provoke Karoline, was now struggling to find his footing. The room had shifted. The balance of power had changed. And Karoline, once again, had emerged victorious in this verbal battle. The interview had ended, but the fallout was just beginning. The clip of Karoline's perfect retort was already trending online, and the reactions were pouring in from every corner of the political spectrum. Social media was ablaze with heated debates. On one side, conservatives hailed Karoline as a champion for standing up for her faith, praising her ability to deliver a clear, no-nonsense defense of her values. On the other side, critics argued that her faith had no place in politics, claiming that she was playing on outdated ideals while ignoring the pressing issues facing the country. The day after the interview, Karoline woke up to a flurry of notifications from reporters, friends, and even strangers, all reacting to her moment of triumph. It was no surprise that the story had gone viral. What had started as a simple political interview had turned into a national conversation about the role of faith in public life. Her phone rang. It was her communications director, Laura. "Karoline, I've been watching the reactions," Laura said, her voice tinged with a mix of excitement and caution. "The response is overwhelming. We're getting calls from major news outlets asking for follow-ups. Some conservative pundits are calling you a hero, while others are questioning whether this approach is sustainable. What do you think?" Karoline leaned against the back of her chair, gazing out the window at the quiet city beyond. "It's to be expected," she said, her voice thoughtful. "The ones who believe in what I stand for will support me. The ones who don't will try to tear me down. But I won't let that stop me." There was a pause on the line before Laura spoke again. "I agree, but we need to be prepared for the fallout. The media isn't going to let this go. Mark Sinclair himself has been posting about the interview all morning, and it's clear he's not letting it slide. There's going to be pressure from both sides." Karoline's mind raced through the events of the past 24 hours. She had expected some backlash. It came with the territory of speaking truth to power. But this was different. The personal nature of Mark's attacks on her faith had struck a nerve, and now the public was divided. She had already received messages of support from individuals across the country who admired her courage, but she was also aware that this could hurt her in the long term, especially if her opponents rallied against her. She knew she couldn't back down. She had spoken her truth, and she couldn't let the critics take that away from her. "Let them talk," Karoline said firmly, her voice steely. "This is bigger than just me. This is about people who feel like their beliefs have been dismissed, who feel like they have to choose between their faith and their political identity. I won't let them be silenced." Laura nodded on the other end. "I hear you. We'll keep pushing forward, but we might need to adjust our strategy. The media is already calling this the faith debate, and it's clear they want to keep it front and center. We can either let them control the narrative, or we can take the reins and make sure people hear our message loud and clear." Karoline leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest. She had never been one to shy away from a challenge. And this moment, as daunting as it was, could be the turning point she needed to make an even stronger impact. It was time to seize control of the conversation. "Let's take the reins," she said decisively. "I'm not just going to sit here and let them use my faith as a weapon against me. I'll speak to the people directly, and I'll make it clear that my faith isn't an obstacle to good policy, it's the foundation of it." Later that day, Karoline addressed the growing firestorm with a speech to the press that would change the trajectory of the debate. Standing in front of a crowded room of reporters, her message was clear, powerful, and unapologetic. "Thank you all for being here today," Karoline began, her voice ringing with clarity. "Yesterday's interview sparked a conversation that's long overdue. The question isn't whether faith has a place in politics. The real question is, does faith have a place in our hearts, in our communities, and in our lives? The answer to that is yes, and I stand by that answer." She paused, letting her words sink in. "My faith isn't just something I talk about on Sundays," she continued, her tone unwavering. "It's a part of me, it's part of my identity, and it informs every decision I make. That doesn't mean I'm trying to force my beliefs on anyone, but it does mean that I'm here to serve people, not politics. I'm here to fight for justice, for equality, and for the people who don't have a voice. And my faith gives me the strength to do that." The room was silent as she spoke, the press captivated by the sincerity in her voice. And let's be clear, Karoline continued, her voice growing stronger, having faith doesn't mean ignoring the real issues that we face as a nation. It means facing those challenges with compassion, with integrity, and with a commitment to doing what is right, not what is easy. My faith compels me to fight for policies that serve the most vulnerable, that ensure every person has access to the same opportunities, regardless of their background. Her words hit home. The press room, once filled with skepticism, was now filled with an air of respect. She had flipped the script, taking control of the narrative and addressing the concerns that had been raised against her. As the press conference wrapped up, Karoline left the stage with a sense of quiet triumph. The media would continue to dissect her words, but she knew one thing for certain: she had said exactly what needed to be said, and she had done so with confidence and conviction. Back at the office, her team was buzzing with activity. "That was powerful, Karoline," Laura said with a smile. "You took control of the conversation. The backlash is still coming, but now they know they can't shake you." Karoline nodded, but there was no time to bask in her victory. The storm had only just begun, and she knew that staying firm would be her greatest challenge yet. But for now, she had one thing working in her favor: her unwavering belief in herself and her faith. And that was enough to carry her through whatever was next. The days following the press conference were a whirlwind of interviews, social media commentary, and heated debates. Karoline's words had resonated with many, and the debate over faith and politics was now in the spotlight, with people on both sides of the issue weighing in. But while the conversation raged on, Karoline knew that it wasn't enough to simply respond to the noise. She needed to bring the discussion to a deeper level, one that would unite people, regardless of their political beliefs, around the core values that guided her. The media was relentless, but Karoline's resolve had only strengthened. She had already addressed the core arguments against her faith-driven political approach, and now she prepared for the next step. It wasn't just about defending herself, it was about spreading her message of faith, hope, and service in a way that transcended partisan divides. Late one afternoon, Karoline took the stage once more, this time at a town hall in her hometown, where she had spent much of her life shaping the values that guided her. The room was filled with supporters, but also with skeptics who had come to hear her speak. It was the perfect platform for her to deliver her closing thoughts on the matter. As she walked to the podium, she could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another speech, it was the culmination of everything she had been fighting for in the past few weeks. The quiet hum of the crowd slowly faded as Karoline stood tall, her presence commanding attention. She took a deep breath and began, her voice strong, yet filled with warmth. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her eyes sweeping across the room. "It's an honor to stand before you today, to speak not just as a politician, but as someone who is deeply committed to making this country a better place for everyone. For me, that commitment is grounded in faith, faith that we can do better, that we can be better." There was a pause as she allowed the words to sink in. "I've heard the criticisms, I've seen the comments, and I've listened to the doubts. Some say that faith has no place in politics. Others say that it clouds our judgment, that it divides us. But let me be clear, faith is not something that divides us. It is the very thing that calls us to serve others, to fight for justice, and to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. Faith teaches us that we are all children of God, worthy of dignity, respect, and care." Karoline's voice grew more impassioned, but there was no anger in her tone. There was only the quiet strength of someone who knew she was speaking the truth. "I am not here to impose my beliefs on anyone," she continued, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I am here because I believe in the power of service. I believe in the power of compassion. And I believe in the power of unity. When I stand for the most vulnerable, when I fight for policies that lift people up, I am acting on the values that shape who I am. Those values are rooted in my faith, but they are values that transcend religion. They are values that speak to the heart of what it means to be human." The crowd was listening intently now, and Karoline could feel the shift. The skepticism had faded, replaced by an understanding of her deeper motivations. "This is not about pushing a religious agenda," she said, her voice softening. It's about recognizing that our country's strength lies in its people and their ability to come together and care for one another. That's what faith teaches me, that we are all interconnected, that we rise or fall together. And I will always fight to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to rise. The room was silent as she spoke, her words hanging in the air like a promise. Now, I know that there are those who disagree with me. There are those who will continue to challenge the role of faith in politics. But I ask you, what's the alternative? Is it a world where we only look out for ourselves, where we build systems that leave the most vulnerable behind? I don't believe that's the world we want. I don't believe that's the America we want. A quiet murmur ran through the crowd, and Karoline knew that this wasn't just a political message, this was a moral one. She wasn't just asking for people's votes, she was asking for their trust, their belief in the possibility of a better future. So yes, my faith guides me, she said, her voice strong again, but it also teaches me to be compassionate, to be just, and to fight for the truth. It gives me the strength to do what is right, not what is easy. And I will never apologize for that. There was a long, lingering silence before the applause began. At first, it was tentative, hesitant, as though the audience was unsure whether they should fully embrace her words. But soon, it grew louder, more confident. It was a standing ovation, one that echoed with the sound of respect and admiration, not just for her as a politician, but for her as a person of principle. Karoline stood at the podium, her heart pounding with a sense of quiet pride. She had done it. She had stood firm in her faith and her values, and she had found a way to make others see the power of those beliefs without forcing them to agree. She had not only defended her faith, she had shown the world how faith could be a source of strength in the fight for justice and equality. As the applause continued, Karoline stepped down from the stage, her eyes scanning the crowd. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The debates would continue, the challenges would come, and the critics would keep coming after her. But in that moment, she knew one thing for sure: she had done the right thing. She had stayed true to herself, and in doing so, she had inspired others to do the same. The battle over faith in politics was far from over, but Karoline had won the first victory, not just for herself, but for everyone who believed that their faith could guide them toward a better future. And that was a victory worth fighting for.